For the lion! To victory!
Imagine you are standing on a sun-scorched field. Behind you is a ruined town and the endless blue of the Mediterranean Sea. In front of you, the ground itself seems to move. 7,000 of the world's finest cavalry, Mamluks, Turks, and Kurds. The elite of Saladin's unstoppable Armeniar, preparing to charge. Your line is thin. You have perhaps 700 men, maybe a few more, and most of you are knights without horses. You are exhausted, sick with scurvy, and hopelessly outnumbered. Your king, a giant of a man, is also sick, but he is here, on foot, holding a spear like a common soldier. The enemy calls him Malik King Richard. History will call him the Lionheart. And in the next hour, this desperate, outnumbered band is about to achieve the impossible. This is not a siege. This is not a skirmish. This is the story of the Battle of Jaffa, the final, desperate, and legendary clash of the Third Crusade, where 700 men stared down 7,000 and did not break. The year is 1192, the Third Crusade, a grand campaign to reclaim Jerusalem from the great Ayyubid Sultan, Saladin, has ground to a halt. King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, had come within sight of the Holy City, but was forced to turn back. The combined kings of Christendom had fractured. Philip of France had gone home, the German emperor was dead, and Richard's own army was dissolving, worn down by heat, disease, and relentless campaigning. Richard and Saladin, two of history's most iconic rivals, were locked in a stalemate. They were enemies, but they held a deep chivalrous respect for one another. Peace negotiations were underway. Richard, suffering from fever and the debilitating effects of scurvy, had pulled the bulk of his forces back to Acre, preparing to finally sail home to England, where his own brother, John, was plotting to steal his throne. He had left a small garrison in the coastal city of Jaffa, the vital port that served as the lifeline for Christian pilgrims and the last strategic Crusader foothold in the south. Seeing Richard's main army depart, Saladin saw his chance. This was not about chivalry, this was war. He could not allow the Crusaders to keep this dagger pointed at the heart of his territory. On July 27, 1192, Saladin unleashed a massive surprise attack on Jaffa. He wanted to wipe it off the map before the Lionheart could return. He almost succeeded.
The city is ours!
Saladin's army, tens of thousands strong, fell upon Jaffa with ferocious speed. The garrison was tiny, numbering only a few thousand defenders in total, including knights, men-at-arms, and local militia. For 3 days, they fought bravely, but Saladin's sappers mined the walls, and his trebuchets pounded the defenses relentlessly. The Ayyubid soldiers poured through the breaches, and the city became a slaughterhouse. The remaining Crusader soldiers, led by men like the Earl of Leicester and the Knights of the Military Orders, fell back to the city's last line of defense, the citadel. They were trapped, out of food, out of water, and out of hope. They sent a messenger to Saladin to negotiate terms of surrender. Saladin, ever magnanimous in victory, agreed. They would be spared their lives in exchange for a ransom. The garrison, battered and defeated, prepared to give up. The Ayyubid army, sensing victory, began to relax, with many soldiers turning their attention to looting the captured parts of the town. They believed the fight was over. They had forgotten one crucial detail. They had not accounted for the will of one man. Miles north in Acre, Richard was on his ship, his fleet preparing to set sail for England. He was terribly sick, but as he recovered, a messenger, a soldier who had escaped Jaffa by swimming out to a ship, arrived. He collapsed at the king's feet and delivered the news. Jaffa was falling. Chroniclers tell us that Richard's reaction was instantaneous. All thoughts of England, of his fever, of the long journey home, vanished. He reportedly said, "As God lives, I will go to their aid." He didn't wait to gather his main army. He didn't plan a long march. He grabbed what was at hand, a small, elite force of knights, perhaps 50 or 80 in total, including his own household guard, along with around 400 vital Genoese and Paisan crossbowmen, and 2,000 other infantry and sailors. They piled into a handful of galleys and rowed south with all their strength. On July 31st, they arrived. The scene was one of chaos. Saladin's banners flew from the city walls. The beach was crowded with Ayyubid soldiers, and the main army was busy inside the town. Richard's own men urged caution. This was madness. They were sailing a few hundred men into the teeth of an army of thousands. But Richard's galley, emblazoned with his royal standard, did not slow down. The king was the first one off the boat. Legend says he leaped into the chest-deep water, battle axe in one hand, shield in the other. He waded ashore, a towering, terrifying figure in his red surcoat, and began to cut a path through the stunned Ayyubid troops on the beach. He was not a king directing a battle. He was a berserker leading a charge. Inspired by this suicidal bravery, his knights and crossbowmen followed him, crashing into the disorganized enemy ranks. The effect was electric. The defenders in the citadel, hearing the unmistakable sound of Richard's battle cry, "God for us, St. George," were reinvigorated. They grabbed their weapons and launched a desperate counterattack from within the citadel. Saladin's army, caught completely off guard, trapped between Richard's beach assault and the garrison's sally, panicked. They thought Richard had brought his entire army. They broke and fled the city in a rout, streaming back to their main camp. In a matter of hours, against all odds, Richard the Lionheart had recaptured Jaffa.
Faster, men! We must be secure before sundown! The Saracens are watching us!
Saladin was furious. He had been humiliated. His massive army had been routed from a city they had already captured by a handful of men led by a sick king. He pulled his forces back, regrouped, and planned his revenge. He knew Richard's force was tiny. The heroic charge had been a bluff, and Saladin was calling it. Richard, in a move of either supreme confidence or tactical necessity, made a fateful decision. The town of Jaffa was a ruin. It was filled with refuse, corpses, and filth, a breeding ground for the very diseases that were already ravaging his men. Instead of hiding behind its breached and broken walls, Richard ordered his army to make camp outside the city gates. In the open field between Jaffa and Saladin's position, it was an open invitation, a challenge. Richard's army was now truly exposed. He had perhaps 2,000 men in total, but the core of his strike force, his heavy cavalry, was almost non-existent. Most of his knights' horses had been lost or had died. One chronicler, Ambroise, states that of his 50 to 80 knights, only 15 had horses. 15. The rest of his knights, the 700 men of our title, were an assembly of his best heavy infantry. Dismounted knights, men-at-arms, and his elite crossbowmen. He knew Saladin would attack. He was counting on it. He spent the next few days meticulously organizing his small force for the inevitable onslaught. He was not planning to run, he was planning to hold.
A sword and St. George! Stand firm, men!
On the morning of August 5, 1192, it came. Saladin unleashed his entire cavalry force, estimated by Crusader chroniclers at 7,000 riders, in a single, thunderous wave. Their objective was simple: charge, shatter the small infantry line, and annihilate the Crusaders. But Richard was ready. He had anticipated this exact tactic. He deployed his men in a formation of pure, disciplined genius. He ordered his infantry, including the dismounted knights, to form a hedgehog or shaw. The front rank of spearmen knelt, planting the butts of their long spears into the soft earth, with the razor-sharp points angled perfectly to meet the chest of a charging warhorse. Behind them, a second rank of spearmen stood, their spears overlapping. Between them, like porcupine quills, were the crossbowmen. This formation was a fortress of wood and steel. The spearmen provided an impenetrable wall that no horse would willingly charge. The crossbowmen provided the firepower. Richard had them organized in pairs. One man would fire his crossbow weapon, so powerful it could punch through Ayyubid armor at 100 yards, while his partner, protected by a large pave shield, would reload. This allowed for a near-constant, terrifyingly accurate volley of bolts. And what of the 700 knights? The vast majority were in this line, dismounted. Their expensive armor and noble blood meaning nothing more than that they were the strongest, best protected spearmen on the field. Richard himself, still weak with fever, patrolled the line on his horse, one of the precious few available, keeping morale high, plugging any gaps. His voice roaring over the din. Hold the line. Shame on him who lags. Saladin's cavalry, led by his Mamluk bodyguard, charged. They thundered across the field, a terrifying wave of steel and fury, and they slammed into a wall of spears. Horses recoiled, riders were skewered, and the charge faltered, dissolving just yards from the Crusader line. As they wheeled away in confusion, the thwack, thwack, thwack of the crossbows began. Bolts ripped through saddles, through chainmail, and through men. The 1 hour of the battle's legend was not a single charge, but a relentless, agonizing series of them. For an hour or more, Saladin threw his men at the tiny formation. Wave after wave of elite Turkish and Mamluk horsemen charged, tried to find a gap, hurled javelins, and fired arrows, all to no avail. The line did not bend. It did not break. The Crusaders were a disciplined, immovable object. The ground in front of them became a charnel house of horses and men. The Ayyubid cavalry, designed for speed and shock, was breaking itself against an unbreakable wall of infantry. Saladin, watching from a nearby hill, was in disbelief. His finest troops were being systematically dismantled.
Now, brothers, for victory!
The Ayyubid army was not defeated, but it was frustrated, exhausted, and disorganized. Their charges had lost their cohesion. Their morale was cracking. And Richard, the master tactician and born warrior, saw his moment. This was the turning point. He gathered his cavalry, his 15 mounted knights, and a few other mounted sergeants. He looked at his infantry line, still standing strong, and gave the order. The spearmen, at his command, opened small, planned gaps in their formation. Through these gaps rode Richard the Lionheart and his tiny band of horsemen. It was an act of tactical insanity, or sheer, unadulterable genius. 15 knights charging 7,000, but they weren't charging a fresh, organized army. They were charging a mob, a stalled, confused mass of horsemen who had just spent an hour failing to break an infantry line. Richard led the charge himself, lance leveled, his battle cry tearing across the field. This tiny wedge of heavy cavalry, of the most heavily armored men and horses in the world, slammed into the flank of the nearest Ayyubid squadron with the force of a thunderbolt. The impact was devastating. It was the one thing Saladin's men did not expect. They had been fighting a defensive war, and suddenly, the Lionheart himself was in their ranks. The charge shattered the Ayyubid cohesion completely. Panic, which had been simmering, now boiled over. The squadron Richard hit dissolved, and the panic spread like fire. Men and horses, already exhausted from charging the spear wall, now saw their comrades fleeing and their lines collapsing. A full-scale rout began. Saladin's 7,000-man cavalry force, one of the most feared armies in the world, turned and fled the field, utterly crushed by a tactical masterstroke from a handful of dismounted infantry and a final glorious charge by 15 knights. The battle was so one-sided that the chivalrous Saladin himself was reportedly impressed. A story, perhaps apocryphal, tells that during the fight, Saladin saw Richard's horse go down. Seeing his great rival fighting on foot, Saladin sent him to fresh Arab stallions as a gift, stating that such a king should not be fighting as a common soldier. Richard, testing them first, accepted.
Victory! We have won! God wills it!
So, how did 700 knights crush 7,000 in an hour? The answer is a masterpiece of military science. It wasn't 700 mounted knights charging 7,000, it was a combined arms victory of unparalleled discipline. First, it was tactics. Richard recognized his weakness, a lack of cavalry turned it into his strength. He forced Saladin to fight on his terms, to attack a prepared, static infantry position. Second, it was technology and discipline. The combination of the rooted spear wall and the devastating armor-piercing power of the Genoese crossbowmen created a kill zone that Saladin's light cavalry simply could not penetrate. And third, it was leadership. It was Richard's personal, almost maniacal, bravery first in wading ashore to retake the city, and then in leading the final, decisive charge himself. He inspired his men to fight beyond the limits of human endurance. The Battle of Jaffa was a total Crusader victory, but it was also the end. Both sides were exhausted. Richard was still sick, and his army was too small to capitalize on the victory. Saladin, while his army was routed, was not destroyed, but his one last attempt to drive the Crusaders into the sea had failed spectacularly. A few weeks later, the two leaders signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The Third Crusade was officially over. Jerusalem would remain in Saladin's hands, but the Crusader states would keep a strip of coastline from Acre to Jaffa. And, most importantly for Richard, Saladin guaranteed that unarmed Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter Jerusalem and visit its holy sites. The Battle of Jaffa secured the existence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for another century. It was the final act of the Third Crusade, a campaign defined by its two greatest protagonists. Saladin had secured his greatest prize, Jerusalem, and Richard, through sheer, indomitable will, had ensured the Christians kept their foothold in the Holy Land. Richard the Lionheart would sail for home, only to be shipwrecked, captured, and held for ransom. He would never return to the Holy Land, but he left behind a legend, cemented on that dusty field outside Jaffa, where he and his few brave men faced an army 10 times their size and emerged, against all logic and all odds, as the undisputed victors.
The Battle of Thermopylae, often depicted in legend, was a pivotal moment not just for the Greeks, but for the future of warfare itself.
The Battle of Jaffa is one of the most incredible against all odds victories in military history, but it's just one of so many. The medieval world was full of clashing tactics, from the longbowmen of Agincourt to the pike squares of the Swiss. If you want to see more breakdowns of epic historical battles, tell us in the comments below which one we should cover next. And, as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And click that bell icon so you never miss another story of tactics, courage, and conquest. Thanks for watching.